I want you to just close your eyes for a second if you can and really sit with the weight of the era you live in. You live in a time with unprecedented access to knowledge. Think about the sheer volume of context you carry around with you every single day.
It is a heavy thing to carry.
It really is. You probably understand psychology, complex cognitive biases, intricate social structures, and historical narratives far better than any generation that came before you. You have the entire sum of human knowledge sitting right there in your pocket.
Right.
You can instantly deconstruct a political argument. You have the vocabulary to recognize your own blind spots, and you can see the invisible systemic forces governing our world. Yet with all of this incredible hyper-awareness, there is this pervasive, almost suffocating feeling that you are more stuck, more uncertain.
And more unable to act.
Exactly. Unable to act than ever before. Knowing so much, having all of the context, somehow feels like a trap. It is this profound paralysis of the hyper-aware. And that is what we are gently unpacking tonight.
That paralysis is, it's arguably the defining psychological paradox of our time. When you possess the analytical tools to see the flaws in every single system, taking any definitive action begins to feel inherently compromised.
Yeah.
But I want to assure you listening, this feeling of being frozen in the face of immense complexity isn't just a personal failing. It is not a glitch in your individual psychology. It is the central visceral symptom of a massive cultural and philosophical shift. We are navigating the turbulent waters between eras right now.
We really are drifting between these massive paradigms. Which brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. Tonight, we are exploring a framework that attempts to name and navigate this new space. It's called metamodernism.
Metamodernism.
Yes. We are drawing quietly but heavily on the foundational concepts outlined by cultural theorists Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin van den Akker. They wrote this pivotal 2010 essay called Metamodernism, Navigating the Oscillation Between Irony and Sincerity. And we'll also be looking at a broader ecosystem of thought that is built upon their work since then.
It's a fascinating ecosystem.
It is. Our goal for this deep dive is to map out what actually comes after that old binary of modern optimism and postmodern skepticism. We're going to take our time and examine how metamodernism operates as a cultural force, trace its deep philosophical roots, look at how it attempts to solve our modern-day meaning crisis, and even explore its theoretical political applications.
And we have to look closely at the mechanics of this mindset. Metamodernism isn't just some abstract theory relegated to dusty academic journals. It is a deeply practical lens for understanding the friction you experience every time you read the news, or watch a piece of contemporary media, or simply try to make a significant life decision.
It's the water we're swimming in.
Precisely. We will be mapping out its historical lineage to show how these ideas evolved and examining its approach to truth and reality. Crucially, we also need to spend time analyzing its failure modes. Understanding how this cognitive framework can break down and lead to severe intellectual exhaustion is vital if we want to use it to actually move forward.
To really grasp the mechanics of metamodernism, I don't think we need to spend too much time defining the eras that came before it. I mean, we are all intimately familiar with the modernist dream of absolute truth, that mid-century belief that science, rationality, and linear progress would inevitably save us.
The pure optimism.
Right. And then, of course, the postmodern project of radical deconstruction that followed it. We know that postmodernism was incredibly useful for dismantling unfair systems, but that it ultimately left us in the rubble.
It did.
If you deconstruct a house to see exactly how it is built, well, you are left with a pile of bricks, but you no longer have a shelter.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. You are out in the cold. And what Vermeulen and van den Akker proposed in their 2010 essay was a diagnosis of how contemporary culture is attempting to build shelter again out of those scattered bricks. They observed that we aren't just reverting to the naive sincerity of modernism. We can't unknow what we know.
We can't go backward.
No. Nor are we staying mired in the pure, detached irony of postmodernism. We are doing something much more dynamic. We are oscillating between the two.
Oscillating like a pendulum.
Yes. That concept of oscillation is the absolute engine of the metamodern condition. It is not a neat synthesis where the two extremes blend into some muted, gray middle ground. It is a constant, rapid movement between belief and doubt. You accept both simultaneously.
That sounds exhausting, but also deeply familiar.
It is both. You can be acutely aware of the absurdities, the historical baggage, and the systemic flaws of an institution. You can employ the full weight of postmodern irony and critique. But, and this is the key, You simultaneously harbor a genuine, unironic desire to participate in that institution and build something better.
You hope and then you doubt.
You believe, and then you employ irony. The mindset is literally a metronome swinging violently between a drive for earnest action and the safety of detached observation.
I think everyone listening in the dark right now can feel that pendulum swing in their own daily lives. Just think about it. You might go to a protest or volunteer for a cause or vote in an election with genuine, swelling hope that your actions are contributing to a better world. That is pure sincerity.
Sincerity in action.
Yes. But then, almost immediately, you get home, you open social media, and you make a highly cynical, self-deprecating joke about how doomed the political system is. You joke about how meaningless individual action is in the face of global capital. That is pure irony.
And you're holding both of those contradictory truths in your head at the exact same time.
It is a remarkable cognitive balancing act. But the text warns us that this balancing act takes a severe psychological toll on us. The oscillation has distinct failure modes, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The cognitive load required to maintain that oscillation is immense. While this rapid swinging can be an incredible generator for creativity and highly nuanced problem-solving, its dark side manifests as a crippling psychological paralysis.
The paralysis we were talking about at the very beginning.
Yes. When you are constantly oscillating between hyper-awareness of all potential pitfalls and a desperate yearning for genuine action, the friction generates heat. And eventually, that heat leads to burnout.
It's that classic analysis paralysis, but amplified to an existential level.
It is endless reflection without action.
Yeah.
Because you have the tools to foresee every possible negative outcome, because you can deconstruct the hidden biases in your own motivations, you become terrified to make a move. You become so tangled in the complexities of any given choice, whether it's a career move, a relationship decision, or a political stance, that you just freeze.
You just stop.
The internal tension of holding belief and doubt simultaneously simply drains your cognitive reserves, leading to a profound state of intellectual and emotional exhaustion.
It is like having 100 tabs open on your browser, and they are all streaming high-definition video at the same time. Eventually, the fan spins up, the system gets too hot, and it just crashes. So if this exhausting oscillation is the core mechanism, we really need to look at how it actually manifests out there in the world.
We do.
The analysis we're looking at breaks metamodern thought down into 3 major schools, or flavors, which perfectly illustrates how pervasive this shift is across completely different domains of human life. Let's start with the most visible one, which is cultural metamodernism.
Cultural metamodernism is essentially the aesthetic symptom of the mindset. It focuses on the arts, film, literature, architecture, and of course, digital culture. This is where we see the combination of irony and sincerity playing out in real-time narrative structures.
It's what we are watching and reading right now.
Exactly. Unlike the media of the late 90s or early 2000s, which often relied on a kind of cold, detached irony where caring about things was framed as inherently uncool or naive, contemporary culture has fundamentally shifted.
We see this absolutely everywhere in modern storytelling. If you think about the dominant tropes in contemporary television or cinema right now, the characters are incredibly self-aware. They might explicitly call out the cliches of the genre they are in, or the script might utilize a very dry, sarcastic wit that constantly undercuts the tension.
A very postmodern technique.
Right. But crucially, beneath that layer of postmodern armor, these stories are delivering massive gut punches of genuine emotional depth. They tackle intergenerational trauma, the search for meaning, and deep human connection with absolute earnestness. They give you this potent mix of idealism and realism. They allow you to be sarcastic, but they still demand that you care.
That integration is the true hallmark of the cultural shift. The irony acts as a shield. It allows the sincerity to exist without feeling overly sentimental or naive to an audience that is hypersensitive to manipulation.
It protects the soft underbelly of the emotion.
Exactly. Now, the second category we see is philosophical metamodernism, which takes this dynamic and applies it to the structural pursuit of meaning. Philosophically, we are keenly aware that we cannot ignore the postmodern critique. We have seen behind the curtain of grand narratives. We know about the power dynamics and the historical biases embedded in our systems.
The curtain has been pulled back and we can't unsee the wizard.
We can't. But philosophical metamodernism argues that we cannot simply live in the rubble of that deconstruction forever. We have an ethical obligation to reconstruct.
We have to pick up those flawed bricks we talked about earlier and build a new house, fully acknowledging that the house will not be perfect. We have to construct meaning while knowing full well that the meaning is constructed. It's a very quiet, noble sort of effort.
It is.
And that ties directly into the third school, developmental metamodernism. This one is fascinating to me because it moves from art and philosophy into the actual study of human consciousness itself. It leans on the idea that human cognition and our capacity for moral and systemic complexity actually evolve through distinct stages.
Developmental metamodernism suggests that as the external world becomes exponentially more complex, our internal cognitive frameworks must adapt to process that complexity. The oscillation we discussed, the ability to hold multiple conflicting truths simultaneously without immediately trying to resolve them into a simple binary, is viewed as a higher stage of cognitive development.
So the confusion is actually growth.
Yes, it is the mind stretching to accommodate a reality that refuses to be categorized neatly.
That stretches our understanding of reality itself, which pushes us right into the heavier philosophical concepts of the framework, epistemology and ontology. Let's gently unpack how a metamodern thinker approaches the nature of truth and existence. Because moving past the old epistemological debates, where we were endlessly stuck between modernist absolute truth and postmodern relativity, brings us to this incredibly useful, almost liberating concept of truth.
To appreciate metamodern epistemology, we have to recognize the specific deadlock it is trying to break. It fundamentally rejects the absolute, unwavering certainty of modernism, that old belief that there is one single objective truth that can be perfectly captured and applied universally. But it equally rejects the radical relativism of postmodernism.
That postmodern idea that everything is just a social construct, or that all narratives are equally valid, which ultimately becomes a very toxic intellectual dead end for us, because if nothing is objectively true, then nothing matters, and there is absolutely no foundation for morality or justice or progress.
And that is the trap of pure relativism. If you deconstruct truth entirely, you eliminate the capacity for meaningful action. The metamodern intervention here is the concept that truth becomes provisional but meaningful.
Provisional but meaningful. I really want you listening tonight to let that phrase drift over you and internalize it. Provisional but meaningful. Because it really is the antidote to the analysis paralysis we talked about earlier.
It completely reframes the entire pursuit of knowledge. It means we actively pursue truth, and we build systems upon it, knowing full well that our understanding is incomplete and may never be perfectly final.
It's an ongoing journey.
We might discover new data tomorrow, or encounter a new perspective that completely shifts our paradigm. But, and this is the crucial part, we recognize that the pursuit itself has deep intrinsic value, and that the provisional truths we arrive at today are sturdy enough to act upon. We act on the best truth we have in this moment with absolute sincerity, while maintaining the intellectual humility to know it will likely evolve.
You don't have to wait for the pristine, mathematically perfect, absolute truth to take a step forward in the dark. Nor do you have to surrender to the nihilism of thinking truth doesn't exist at all. You simply say to yourself, this is the truest thing I know right now, based on the best available evidence and empathy, and I am going to build my life or my community upon it.
Exactly.
It cures the paralysis by lowering the stakes of action while raising the importance of sincerity. And this epistemological shift naturally extends to metamodern ontology, which is how we understand what actually exists and the nature of reality itself.
Metamodern ontology represents a significant departure from viewing reality as a fixed, static universe. It moves away from the idea that the world is just a collection of isolated, unchanging objects sitting in an empty void. Instead, reality is conceptualized as deeply layered, continuously evolving, and fundamentally relational. It is dynamic and interconnected.
Relational.
Yes, the essence of a thing is not found in its isolated substance, but in its relationship to everything else around it.
When you realize that reality is an unfolding event rather than a static trap, it totally reframes that existential dread that keeps us awake at night. Change is no longer just a terrifying possibility. It is the fundamental fabric of existence. You are part of this interconnected web, and your actions, however provisional they might be, ripple through it.
They absolutely do.
Now, these ideas, provisional truth, evolving reality, the oscillation between sincerity and irony, they didn't just spontaneously generate in the 21st century. The intellectual lineage of metamodernism runs incredibly deep, and tracing this family tree helps us understand why our minds are reacting to the modern world in this specific way.
The foundational ideas of metamodernism draw heavily on several historical predecessors. The most prominent lineage traces back to Romanticism and German idealism, specifically looking at the monumental contributions of thinkers like Immanuel Kant and G.W.F. Hegel in the 18th and 19th centuries. These philosophers were wrestling with the dawn of modernity, trying to understand how reason, imagination, and historical context shape human understanding.
We often think of these philosophers as incredibly dense and disconnected from our daily lives, just heavy books on a shelf. But Kant and Hegel essentially laid the hardware that our modern software runs on. Kant revolutionized our understanding of the mind by arguing that we don't just passively receive reality, our minds actively construct and shape our experience of the world. And Hegel took that active construction and applied it to history itself.
Hegel's introduction of dialectics is particularly vital here. He proposed that human history and human consciousness do not evolve in a straight, peaceful line.
Yeah.
They evolve through a process of inherent contradiction and resolution.
Contradiction and resolution.
Yes, a dominant idea, which he called the thesis, inevitably generates its own opposition, the antithesis. These two forces clash, and out of that friction and tension emerges a new state of being, the synthesis. And that synthesis incorporates elements of both, but transcends them.
Which sounds exactly like the historical blueprint for the oscillation we are experiencing right now. Modernism was the thesis. Postmodernism was the antithesis. And metamodernism is the attempt at synthesis, taking the sincerity of the thesis and the critical irony of the antithesis and trying to forge a new way of engaging with the world. We inherit from German idealism this profound belief that human consciousness is not a fixed trait, but an evolving historical process.
Building on that historical process, the second major lineage brings us into the late 19th and 20th centuries, focusing on pragmatism, the later philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein, and process philosophy. These schools of thought provide the specific practical tools metamodernism uses to navigate our current complexity.
Let's really dig into William James and the American pragmatists. I think pragmatism is the secret weapon for the hyper-aware listener who's currently drowning in theoretical complexity. James basically looked at all the endless spinning debates of philosophy and asked a very different, very grounded question.
James argued that the meaning and the truth of an idea are not found in its abstract perfection, but in its practical consequences. He shifted the focus from asking, is this objectively true in a vacuum, to asking, what happens when we act as if this is true?
A completely different framework.
Entirely. If a belief helps an individual or a society navigate the world more effectively, if it fosters adaptation and flourishing, it possesses a functional truth value. This pragmatist approach is the direct ancestor of our provisional but meaningful truth. It demands that we bring our theories down from the clouds and test them in the friction of daily life.
It is the ultimate cure for the doom loop of overthinking in the middle of the night. Stop paralyzing yourself trying to find the absolute truth of the universe before you make a decision and start asking, does operating under this assumption produce a more compassionate, functional outcome in my community? It demands action over endless reflection. And then we have Ludwig Wittgenstein, whose work on language is incredibly relevant to anyone who has ever tried to argue on the internet.
Wittgenstein's later work completely dismantled the idea that words have fixed, rigid definitions that float out in the ether. He emphasized that the meaning of language is derived entirely from how it is used within specific social contexts, what he famously called language games.
Language games.
Yes. The rules of the game change depending on the community playing it. This perspective highlights the profound degree to which our understanding of reality is socially constructed and shared. It bridges the gap between our internal, isolated thoughts and the external, communal world.
If you've ever watched a piece of slang evolve online, or seen how a specific political community redefines a common word to mean something entirely different, you are watching Wittgenstein's language games play out in real time. Metamodernism takes this understanding that our realities are shaped by shared, evolving language, and asks us to be intentional about the games we choose to play. And finally, rounding out this family tree, we have Alfred North Whitehead and process philosophy.
Process philosophy is the direct, theoretical bedrock for the metamodern ontology we discussed earlier. Whitehead argued forcefully against the traditional Western view that the universe is made up of static, unchanging substances. He posited that reality is fundamentally composed of processes, events, and relationships. An object isn't just a thing. It is a slow-moving event.
I love that phrasing. You are not a finished product. You are an unfolding event. Just breathe into that idea for a moment. You are an unfolding event. I think that realization is absolutely crucial when we confront the immense psychological weight of what philosopher John Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis. Because if you view yourself and your society as fixed, broken substances, the meaning crisis feels terminal. But if you view them as ongoing processes, there is room for intervention. Vervaeke argues that this meaning crisis is a massive structural feature of our modern condition.
Vervaeke's analysis is essential for understanding why the metamodern framework is necessary in the first place. He points out that for centuries, humanity relied on traditional religious and mythic structures. These frameworks provided a deeply ingrained, comprehensive sense of existential meaning, communal belonging, and cosmic purpose. They told you exactly where you fit in the grand scheme of things.
You had a place.
You had a definitive place. But as the centuries progressed through the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and the deconstruction of postmodernism, those traditional structures severely weakened or collapsed entirely for vast segments of the population.
And while a scientific worldview rushed in to fill the intellectual void, giving us medicine, technology, and a staggering understanding of the physical universe, it utterly failed to fill the existential void. Science is unparalleled at explaining the how. It can trace the evolutionary lineage of our species and explain the neurochemistry of our brains, but it is fundamentally unequipped and, frankly, not designed to answer the why. It cannot tell us why our lives matter or how we ought to live together.
The result is a society that is technologically hyper-advanced, but existentially starved. We possess the tools to manipulate the atomic structure of the world, but we lack a coherent narrative for why we are doing it. We are wandering through a landscape stripped of inherent meaning. This gap is what metamodernism actively attempts to bridge.
How does it do that?
Well, it acknowledges that we cannot simply regress to a pre-modern, unquestioning faith. Our hyper-awareness prevents us from unseeing the complexities and the scientific realities of the world. But it also recognizes that the purely materialistic, disconnected universe offered by extreme rationality is psychologically unsurvivable for human beings.
We are meaning-seeking creatures, but our critical faculties won't let us accept the old fairy tales anymore. We demand a meaning that can survive the acid bath of postmodern critique. So how does metamodernism actually generate this meaning? A massive part of the answer lies in what is often called the return of feeling.
The return of feeling is perhaps the most visceral relief offered by the metamodern shift. Postmodernism, in its zeal to deconstruct, often cultivated a stance of cold, cynical detachment. Sincerity was viewed with intense suspicion, often labeled as naive or manipulative. Metamodern culture, however, explicitly reclaims the space for genuine emotion. It allows sincerity to return, but it does so without asking you to surrender your critical self-awareness.
It is so exhausting to live behind a wall of irony for decades. There is this palpable hunger right now for genuine connection, for art that doesn't just cleverly deconstruct itself, but actually moves us to our core. And the brilliance of the metamodern integration is that you can have both. You can read a novel or watch a film that utilizes a razor-sharp postmodern critique of modern capitalism, structural inequality, and political corruption. It will use all the sophisticated tools of systemic analysis, but at its very core, that same piece of art will anchor itself to a deeply sincere, emotionally resonant story about human frailty, family, and the desperate need for connection. It delivers the critical awareness and the existential nourishment in the exact same package.
It proves that emotional resonance and intellectual rigor are not mutually exclusive. And if we look at how this integration operates on a personal, psychological level, the obvious question becomes, what happens when we attempt to scale this up? If metamodernism can reconstruct meaning in art and philosophy, can it structurally change society? The literature dives heavily into developmental psychology, theoretical political models, and the overarching concept of the meta-crisis to try and answer this.
You look at developmental psychologists like Jean Piaget and Robert Kegan, and their stage theories of cognition become the blueprint here. It's the idea that our brains have to literally upgrade their operating systems to handle new global complexities. Cognitive evolution isn't just about accumulating more facts. It's about fundamentally changing how we make meaning out of those facts.
Kegan's work on the orders of consciousness is particularly illustrative. He maps out how humans develop from childhood through adulthood, moving from rigid, black-and-white, egocentric thinking toward increasingly complex stages where they can hold multiple perspectives, understand systemic interconnections, and even become aware of their own meaning-making processes.
The meta-mind.
Exactly. The metamodern argument is that the sheer, unprecedented complexity of a globalized, hyper-connected 21st century world is acting as an evolutionary pressure cooker. It is forcing our cognitive capacities to stretch and develop into higher stages just to survive the sheer volume of the information flow.
Which perfectly explains the paralysis of the hyper-aware that we started this deep dive with. That anxiety, that feeling of being stuck in the middle of the night, it isn't a sign that you are broken or uniquely flawed. It is often simply the psychological growing pain of transitioning from a simpler, more absolute stage of cognition to a more complex metamodern stage that can comfortably hold the oscillation between multiple truths.
It's adaptation.
Right. Now, if we take that upgraded cognitive operating system and apply it to the geopolitical realm, things get really interesting. There are theorists trying to imagine what a society built on these principles would actually look like.
This is where metamodern theory attempts to transition from descriptive philosophy into structural design. Theorists like Daniel Gertz and Hansi Freinacht have proposed a conceptual model they call the listening society. Their fundamental premise is that our current political and social systems, which are overwhelmingly organized around pure economics, resource extraction, and zero-sum power dynamics, are structurally insufficient to handle the complexities of the modern world.
The Listening Society proposes a radical recentering. It imagines organizing the primary institutions of a society around the explicit goal of fostering psychological development, emotional intelligence, and cognitive maturity in its citizens. It suggests that a nation's success shouldn't be measured solely by gross domestic product or military might, but by the psychological depth and resilience of its populace.
The rationale is that if you want a functioning, healthy democracy capable of navigating deeply complex global issues like climate change or technological disruption, you absolutely require a citizenry that is psychologically secure, capable of deep empathy, and equipped to think in nuanced, non-binary ways. A listening society would theoretically design its education systems, its healthcare, and its civic institutions to actively support citizens in moving through those developmental stages Keegan talked about.
It's worth noting for anyone listening that the Listening Society is a theoretical model proposed by these specific thinkers in the text. It is not a prescriptive political platform we are endorsing here. It certainly has its critics, and the implementation of such a society raises massive, difficult questions about who gets to define what psychological development even means. But as the thought experiment, it brilliantly illustrates how metamodernism attempts to rebuild structural meaning. It's a vision of governance that prioritizes the internal growth of the human being as the absolute prerequisite for solving external problems. And we desperately need new models of problem solving because the overarching challenge we face isn't just a single issue. It is what the thinkers in the space call the metacrisis.
The metacrisis is a daunting concept, but giving it a name is essential for confronting it. It describes the reality that we are no longer facing isolated, discrete emergencies that can be solved one at a time. We are facing a series of massive, overlapping, and intimately interconnected crises that are all amplifying each other simultaneously.
It is sometimes called the polycrisis. We have a severe ecological and climate crisis that is deeply intertwined with a political crisis marked by deep polarization, institutional decay, and a widespread loss of faith in democratic processes. That, in turn, is accelerated by a technological crisis driven by unaligned artificial intelligence, algorithmic manipulation, and the collapse of shared information ecosystems. And all of this is underpinned by the profound meaning crisis we explored earlier.
A tangled web.
They are all feeding into one another in a massive, tangled web of complexity. You can't untangle the climate crisis without addressing the political polarization, and you can't fix the politics if the population is suffering from an existential meaning crisis that is being constantly exacerbated by algorithmic social media.
The sheer scale of the metacrisis is exactly why the absolute linear thinking of modernism fails. It simply cannot comprehend the interconnected feedback loops. And it is why the cynical deconstruction of postmodernism fails. It offers no mechanism for coordinated reconstructive action. Metamodernism attempts to provide the specific intellectual scaffolding needed to navigate this labyrinth. By embracing provisional truths, by understanding reality as an evolving process rather than a static game, and by maintaining the oscillation between rigorous systemic critique and sincere, hopeful action, we develop the capacity to engage with the metacrisis without succumbing to overwhelming despair.
It gives you the philosophical permission to look at the world and say, the situation is incredibly dire, the systems are deeply flawed, the threats are massive and overlapping, and I'm still going to act with genuine earnestness to build something better. It is the ultimate intellectual defense against doomerism. But of course, no philosophical framework is perfect, and metamodernism is still a relatively young field of thought. To really understand its contours, we have to look at the pushback. What are the scholarly critiques of this framework?
The academic debates surrounding metamodernism are rigorous, and the critiques are vital for keeping the framework honest. A primary criticism is that metamodernism is simply too vague and amorphous. Because its central mechanism relies on fluid concepts like oscillation and provisional truth, critics argue it can become a moving target, allowing its proponents to constantly shift their stance without ever committing to a solid, falsifiable position.
If you are always swinging between irony and sincerity, a critic could easily argue that you are just avoiding the hard work of taking a definitive stand. It can look like an intellectual escape hatch.
There is also the argument that it is insufficiently defined as a rigorous philosophical system. Many opponents suggest that while metamodernism is an excellent cultural description, a highly accurate way of explaining current trends in art, literature, and media consumption, it falls short as a prescriptive philosophy. They argue it doesn't offer concrete enough solutions to actually resolve epistemological disputes or structural political problems. It diagnoses the condition beautifully, but the prescription remains blurry.
They might argue it's mostly just a sophisticated aesthetic, a new coat of paint over the same old existential confusion. And it's important to see that metamodernism is just one lens among many trying to focus on these issues. The intellectual ecosystem grappling with the metacrisis is broad.
Metamodernism shares significant overlaps with several other prominent fields of thought. Complexity theory and systems thinking, for example, are attempting to map out the exact same interconnected realities, but they do so using mathematics, network science, and empirical data rather than cultural theory. Ecological philosophy deeply aligns with the metamodern ontology of relational, interdependent processes.
You also have frameworks like integral theory, which makes its own comprehensive attempt to map human consciousness and societal development across stages. And some scholars simply prefer the term post-postmodernism, choosing to focus on the literal chronological aftermath of postmodern thought, rather than adopting the specific mechanics of the metamodern oscillation.
The terminology is honestly less important than the shared recognition across all these fields that a fundamental shift is occurring. Metamodernism happens to offer an incredibly resonant vocabulary for describing the internal psychological experience of living through that shift.
And giving a name to that experience is incredibly powerful. We have covered a massive expanse of intellectual territory in this deep dive tonight. We started with the paralyzing paradox of the hyper-aware, having the context of the world but feeling unable to move within it. We traced the cultural pendulum swing from modernist absolute belief through the deconstructive irony of postmodernism to the rapid, exhausting oscillation of metamodernism.
We examine how that oscillation manifests in our daily lives, driving incredible narrative creativity while risking severe analysis paralysis. We dug into the profound shift toward provisional but meaningful truth and the ontology of an evolving relational reality, grounding those concepts in the historical lineage of Kant, Hegel, William James, and Whitehead.
We confronted the meaning crisis and the vital return of genuine feeling in our culture. We looked at how these concepts attempt to scale up into the developmental psychology of Kegan and Piaget, theoretical models of governings like the listening society, and the ultimate tangled challenge of the metacrisis. All while balancing this against the necessary critiques of the framework. Understanding this architecture fundamentally explains the cognitive friction you experience every single day. Embracing the concept of provisional truth really can be the key to unlocking the paralysis of hyper-awareness.
Having the vocabulary to articulate your own cognitive dissonance is the first necessary step toward reclaiming your agency. But as we synthesize all of this, I want to leave you with a final unexamined thought that builds directly on the mechanics we've mapped out today. If metamodernism is truly defined by this rapid ongoing oscillation between belief and doubt, and the primary failure mode of that swinging pendulum is severe intellectual exhaustion, we have to consider what happens when the pendulum finally runs out of momentum. Perhaps the ultimate goal of understanding metamodernism isn't simply to get better at balancing sincerity and irony indefinitely. Perhaps the true objective is to use that very friction, the exhausting, immense tension of holding both extremes in your mind, to generate a completely new type of action. An action where we finally accept that acting decisively while remaining deeply fundamentally uncertain is the highest possible form of human evolution.
Acting decisively while remaining deeply uncertain. Using the friction to spark the action. That is a profoundly powerful place to leave it for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. As you drift to sleep tonight, and as you navigate the complexities of your week, try to observe the oscillation in your own mind. Notice when you retreat into the safety of irony. Notice when you lean into the vulnerability of sincerity. And see if you can use that very friction to propel yourself forward in the dark. Until next time.